All right, guys, welcome to our first lecture on the history of combat sports. We're going to look at the very early history of boxing, prize fighting. I'm going to try to do my best to keep this short and to make it interesting by kind of telling it in kind of a stories type format. But the idea of fighting in general has been part of our society for thousands of years. We know it was practiced during the original Olympic Games. Homer refers to some type of fighting, fist fighting in the Iliad, and it was regular entertainment in Roman culture, and we think that's how it made its way into English or British culture. Was that it was practiced in Britain during Roman rule. We know for a fact that the 1681 was the earliest mention of a boxing match in British culture, which was a fight between the footman of Duke of Albemarle's and the town butcher. So, really, the first English champion we know of was James Figg, and Figg was an interesting guy. And you have to understand at this time, guys, there was a difference between prize fighting and boxing. Okay, boxing was seen as exercise. Okay, something that you could go do, much like what you see people go do today with jiu-jitsu, things like that. Prize fighting was illegal. Okay, because it involved money. And what Figg did is he developed an academy around 1719, and he kept it through the 1720s that taught all types of fighting. He taught sword fighting. He taught quarterstaff, which, if you think about that, is like fighting with sticks. And he taught boxing. And keep in mind, this is bare knuckles. And boxing was so popular at that time as an exercise in England that King George had a ring put up in Hyde Park. Okay, but it was a very crude sport at this time. Okay, had a lot of wrestling, a lot of eye gouging, a lot of throat punching, things that we would not consider in boxing now. Jack Broughton developed the first set of rules, and they stayed in place for about 100 years. He's considered the father of boxing. And what he did is he tried to somewhat formalize a little bit more of the rules. Okay. He really kind of did this based on a tragedy that he experienced himself, where he was fighting a friend of his, George Hull, in 1741, and ended up killing him. And so he kept fighting until he was blinded in a fight by Jack Slack. But some things that he did that really kind of revolutionized the sport was he too had a boxing academy. Okay, where a lot of English royalty would come to, but he offered lessons using what were the first kind of set of gloves. He basically muffled your hands with wraps that would make people not get so banged up, not only their hands but their faces. And so this allowed people who were in English royalty to be able to come fight with him. So his rules kind of stayed in place for about 100 years. And they were replaced in 1838 by the London prize ring rules. And these are the rules that somewhat still govern boxing. They put into place a 24-foot ring. You had 30 seconds to kind of a 30-second pause if you were knocked down. And then after the 30 seconds, the referee started an 8 count at which you had time to come to scratch, what basically meant there were marks in the middle of the ring, which you had to toe that mark in order to show the referee that you were ready to fight again. Now, backtracking a little bit back to Jack Broughton and his rules, one of the things he instituted in those rules were the 30-second count. That once you knocked down to one knee, you could stay there for 30 seconds, and the other opponent couldn't hit you. But this was quickly taken advantage of because as soon as people would come off of one knee, they would get slugged by their opponent. So just looking at some kind of famous English fighters, and these are kind of going to go in order. So these kind of replaced each other. Daniel Mendoza was a famous Jewish fighter, and he kind of was known as being a little bit of a brawler, and he was quickly replaced by John Jackson, who was kind of known as an artful fighter, somebody who looked like what we would think of a fighter now. He had a strategy to it. Jim Belcher was a very famous boxer who held championships but lost. He had to forfeit his championships because he got hit in the eye playing some kind of racket sport. Okay, Henry Pierce, he preceded Belcher, and Pierce had a real famous fight with John Gully, which was a 64-round fight, in which was Pierce was eventually knocked out by a punch to the throat. Now, I'm going to stop and kind of backtrack on something. That understand that rounds were not necessarily like we think of rounds today. Okay, these rounds in bare knuckle fighting, a round was essentially over when somebody got knocked down. Okay, so you see these very, very long rounded fights, but we don't often know how long in time they were. Tom Cribb kind of came into being a really skillful, very famous English fighter. Cribb had a very famous fight, and we'll talk about that in a second with an American fighter. But Cribb was very much seen as a very prominent English champion. So Americans started to kind of enter into the fighting world by traveling to England to fight. Bill Richmond was the first African-American fighter from the United States to make a trip to England, but the most prominent one known was Tom Molyneux. He was a former slave, and Molyneux won his freedom through fighting. So Cribb, the English fighter, and Molyneux had a really controversial fight in 1810. As the story goes, Molyneux was real talented, but Cribb kind of beat him in a vicious fight, but he kind of took advantage of him. Molyneux was really winning the fight and on his way to knocking Cribb out. And Cribb accused Molyneux of carrying bullets in his hands. The idea of carrying the bullets was to make his fist punch harder. And so this kind of created a controversy that stopped the fight. And that controversy that stopped the fight allowed Cribb to rest. And keep in mind, these fights were outside. And this one was particularly in the winter. And the cold started to take advantage and take its toll on Molyneux. And Cribb eventually went on to win the fight. Cribb went into retirement, and Molyneux claimed the championship. But in 1811, Cribb came out of retirement to fight Molyneux. And Molyneux was not known for being a very bright boxer. Okay, and this was a huge fight. But prior to the match, Molyneux had eaten a whole chicken and apple pie and drank 4 pints of beer. Okay, during the fight, he managed to close Cribb's eye, but he couldn't fight very long, and Cribb essentially outlasted him in the 11th round. So prize fighting really started to fall off in England, and it changed as Queen Victoria took reign of England. And during this Victorian era, you kind of had a change of culture, and boxing, prize fighting really was frowned upon. And so you started to see a lot of fighters come to America and the sport really failed to be able to kind of hold its own. There was one really last great prize fight in England. It was Tom Sayer versus John Heenan, who was from New York, and this was quite a spectacle, guys. The police knew it was going on. They knew it was illegal, and they kind of let it happen anyway. And basically, kind of to read a passage to it from you from a description of the fight, this will kind of give you an idea of what it was like. Sayers found the big man easy to hit. He cut him open in the 6th round and landed a heavy punch to Sayers' right arm, rendering it useless. Sayers boxed one-handed from then on, chipping away at Heenan's face and closing his right eye in the 7th. Heenan hurt his left hand, which was swollen and puffy, and so it went on round after round, with Sayers weak but cheerful by the 25th round. Heenan was suddenly tiring in the 29th, and his left eye seemed to be closing too. By the 36th, his face was in terrible mess, but he still had the strength to pin Sayers against the ropes and put all of his weight on the little man's throat. He applied the same tactic in round 37, at which point the police finally closed in on top of the fight, only to find the crowd close even farther. The ring was now only a few feet wide. Both the two men fought on for 5 more so-called rounds before the officials finally had their way and called it a halt. Heenan ran away, but within minutes was unable to see. Sayers, with his arms feared broken and desperately tired, was helped to his carriage. Both guys received commemorative belts. Okay, and there was a famous song or ballad that talked about that fight that said, "They fought like lions in the ring. Both men did bodily stand. Their 2 hours and 6-minute fight, and neither beat his man." So this was the great last fight. And that kind of one that gives you an idea of how long the fight really was, okay? So kind of transfer it in. We talked about the move to kind of the Queensberry rules in 1867, and they kind of banned wrestling, required gloves that were fair size, moved to 3-minute rounds with a rest, and they had a point system for where if nobody knocked anybody out, you had points to determine who won, okay? And bare knuckles fights still existed. And probably the greatest bare knuckle fighter in history was an American named John Sullivan, the Boston Strong Boy. He was the last great bare knuckle champion. His fight against Jack Kilrain was a classic fight in Richburg, Mississippi. The fight was stopped in the 75th round. They fought for over 3.5 hours. And Sullivan eventually transferred into gloved fighting, but he couldn't do it. He couldn't figure it out. He lost the fight to gentleman Jim Corbett in 1892. But Sullivan did a couple of things, positive and negative, for the sport. One, he set a precedent that is carried on through over 100 years of fighting. He was a heavyweight, which has always been the most popular weight class. But he made more money outside of boxing than he did in boxing. He starred in vaudeville shows where he was started as himself, and this set the precedent for what you see future heavyweights that we'll talk about doing this. And he also set a very negative precedent that carried for many years, where he would refuse to fight African-American fighters. So this is what we'll conclude this week, guys. We'll pick up next week and go another 30 or so years into to the history of combat sports.